we have to gain from perspective? Much. Welcome to part 2 of our 2-part conversation with Dara Horn. I'm Amy Zabi with the Jerusalem Connection Red Alert for December 1. Dara is an established novelist and recently published her first nonfiction book called People Love Dead Jews. Dara's repertoire of work also includes essays and articles published in a variety of periodicals as she comments on various events that affect the Jewish community and beyond. Dara's insights are valuable to the entire community. She is challenging us to examine our own motives and to truly put ourselves into the shoes of those we seek to advocate for by learning as much as we can about the Jewish people in all their glorious variety, as well as what makes them unique among our culture, deserving every right to health, safety, security, and goodwill. You can find Dara's work collected on her website, darahorn.com. You can also find links to her podcast, Adventures with Dead Jews. Anybody who reads your entire book will probably be able to get a sense of how you would answer this question. But if you're reading something in the news today, or you're listening to somebody on television, whether it's a company CEO or a congressperson or a social media influencer who says, well, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist, what would your reaction to that be?
I mean, it's now become like, some of my best friends are Jewish.
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of the same line, right?
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, I feel like, is there some like, imaginary world in which like one can be, anti-Zionist without being I mean, yeah, there's probably some intellectual plane where this is possible, but like the reality in practice is, again, this is just sort of this this become what it really becomes in practice in pretty much every instance is that this is like a non-Jewish society that's sort of imposing on Jews how they're allowed to be. Right. And that's the part, that, and I mean, that's so funny is like, when people are like, oh, but can't we have criticism of Israel? I'm like, have you ever been to Israel? Like, there's nobody in Israel who's not criticizing Israel all day long, right? Like every single person in Israel. It's like Jewish, non-Jewish, doesn't matter. Every single person, I mean, and kind of like the United States that way, right? I mean, are there things I don't like about America? Yeah, there are. But like when a teenage Jewish girl posts a video saying Shabbat Shalom on TikTok and then gets thousands of trolls saying free Palestine, you BITCA. It's like, that's not a conversation about Israel.
Right.
That's not what's happening there. And I'm not sure why we're pretending that that's what's happening there.
Exactly.
Because, I mean, and the act of pretending that that's what's happening there is sort of part of this gaslighting that American Jews have really been like putting up with for a really long time.
And that, I mean, that's just what we try to do here in our weekly videos is as I try to go through the contemporary trending items or news stories or economic events where we end up with that notion of, okay, well, I'm just going to have something about my Jewish identity, like Malaim I'm saying her name wrong. The gal who is the Jeopardy.
Oh, Mayim Bialik.
Mayim Bialik, Blossom. That's how old I am. She was my Blossom.
Yes.
Clearly she supports the state of Israel. That doesn't mean she thinks it's perfect and does no wrong, right?
But the fact that you have to say that every single time. It's part of the tediousness. Like, I'm not going to here every single time and be like, here's who I voted for in Congress and here's who I didn't vote for. Like, I don't sit there and say that every single time I say I'm American.
Exactly. And I'm patriotic. That doesn't mean I think America does everything right all the time. We can all say that about whatever country we live in. But so she's religious, right? She espouses in her blogs and her social media, things about her family that demonstrate her faith and her practice. And yet, she got appointed, or asked, not appointed, but she got asked to be the host of Jeopardy. And then there was this backlash that she was like too Zionist to be an impartial, neutral host on
Jeopardy.
On an
Jeopardy.
entertainment program. It's not a news program. Meanwhile, the new curator of news for Twitter. Did you see this one? It came out a couple days ago. So Twitter hired a curator for the news, like to curate the news articles that get tweeted or whatever. And she's a former Al Jazeera person whose personal social media is very anti-Israel. I mean, absolutely anti-Zionist for sure, but it bleeds into the rest. And now she's the curator for the Middle East like news hub of Twitter. And at some point, I try to encourage our viewers to peel back those layers and think logically. You're such a logical thinker, Dara, and that's why I want our followers to read your work, because you just peel back the layers in a very logical sense. Like, for example, when you said the zoning issue in upstate New York, well, the perpetrator was from 45 minutes away. He probably didn't care about the zoning, but start to identify those things that don't make any sense. Even though the media is saying, well, this is this and this is this, and here's the lines we drew, the dots for you to connect. It's our job to go back and look at those dots, and are they really connectable? And what dots we are finding is that the BDS movement and other organizations aren't just about the current modern state of Israel and any particular policy that they might have going on in territories or whatnot. It goes way further back than that, right? It's the fact that there's just Jewish people, religious or otherwise, that they don't want there, or they don't want to exist.
Well, I mean, it kind of goes, like, as I say in the title of my book, people love dead Jews, living Jews not so much. And what that really means is, like, people are deeply uncomfortable with living Jews, because, like, there's this sort of, there's something that, and I feel it is really built very deeply into a lot of Western civilization, that Jews are only acceptable if they're powerless, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to, whether that means politically impotent or dead, right? And that's really sort of what you see. And so there's you can kind of put this glaze over it where it's like oh, I'm just anti-Zionist, but, like, I mean, what you're basically saying is it's not okay for Jews to have agency.
Right.
That's what you're actually saying. And so that's sort of, and that's, a lot of what, I'm pushing back against in the book. And I mean, the book doesn't really even talk about Israel very much at all.
Right, exactly.
It really doesn't, because, I mean, you don't even have to go there, because, there's you see so much of this here. And, I mean, that's sort of what was sort of, so troubling to me, is sort of this. And then there's also this, like, idea that, somehow, promoting this kind of, like, Holocaust education is going to prevent anti-Semitism. But that again goes back to that idea that we have about, as I said earlier, people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. Like, it's very easy to go to a Holocaust museum and, you will hopefully feel sad about the history, but, like, it makes you feel good about yourself, because you're like, I mean, we all look great compared to Nazis.
Right.
I mean, like, that's like, that's not a hard bar to clear. And, like, but what I noticed is it's like, whenever there's, like, some public figure who, like, says something anti-Semitic, like, they get taken to a Holocaust museum, then they, like, say some pious thing about, like, oh, this is so sad. But, like, that's sort of like that, that is really sort of, that removes the agency, right? Mm-hmm. Because then you don't have to engage with living Jews, right? You don't have to engage with anybody who's participating in what Jewish life is now. A big part of which is relationship to the state of Israel in whatever form that may take. Mm-hmm. But, and also, like, a part of which is Jewish religious tradition too, right? And so, like, you don't have to participate if, by going to a Holocaust museum, all of that is erased, right? And even, like, the way you think about, Jewish victims of the Holocaust is it erases their Jewish identities often, right? So this is something I don't talk about this specifically in the book. I do talk about it in my podcast.
Yes, I think it was the first episode where you explained that context from your
Adventures with Dead Jews is my podcast, because the world's love for dead Jews was far too vast for one book to contain. So the podcast is different stories than the ones in the book. And I talk about the children's exhibit at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, where, you know, it's like you walk through, it's called Daniel's story, and it's like you walk through the house of this, like, you know, Jewish boy from Frankfurt, and you go to his bedroom and you see his like soccer trophies and his dad's war medals, and you know, his after school snacks or whatever, and then, you know, you go to like his family's room in the ghetto or whatever. And like, but what's interesting to me about that is that the museum chose as their representative of Jewish children who were murdered in the Holocaust this German speaking child whose life looks a lot like American children's lives, right? Like, and, you know, I was challenged by this. You know, I first went to that museum as a teenager, and I remember sort of being impressed by this, like, oh, wow, this teaches American kids that, you know, Jewish kids who died in the Holocaust are just like them. And I remember, you know, 30 years ago when this museum opened, talking to a Holocaust survivor about this, and her getting really angry at me because she says, you know, well, what if they weren't just like them? Would it have been okay to murder them if they weren't just like them? And then she sort of pointed out, like, why do they have this German speaking, you know, child as their representative of children who died in the Holocaust? Like, why do we have his soccer trophies on the shelf? Why not his like Jewish religious texts on the shelf, right? Or why not his like, you know, Zionist scouting uniform on the shelf, right? Like, why do we have dad's, you know, why do we have dad's war medals from the German army? Why not having, you know, dad's, you know, his tallis, like his prayer shawl, right? Why not have dad's, you know, tickets to the Yiddish theater, right? Like, there's sort of this erasure of Jewish culture that is like, yes. And then you have the same, and I honestly think it's like a flaw in the way we talk I mean, it's not just, I'm sure it's, you know, similar problem in other countries, but the way we think about like anti-bigotry education in this country is that we have this thing that we do where we tell people, you know, oh, see this group fill in the blank over here that you might be prejudiced against, like, you shouldn't hate those people because, you know, they're just like everyone else. And I mean, the problem with this is that Jews spent 3,000 years not being like everybody else, right? Like, I mean, going back to 3,000 years ago when, like, you know, Jews were the only ones like worshiping the bossy, unsexy, invisible God. Yeah. Right. Like that wasn't cool.
Right. And I agree with that. And when I heard your first podcast before I got your book, and I felt like my eyes were open because, yeah, Jewish people, and I'm not trying to minimize your point, I'm trying to just, the humanity, all of us are just as human as everybody else, right? And that means our value and our rights and our access to our inalienable rights. But it's also okay to be different. Like, you don't erase their uniqueness in order to emphasize our sameness being our humanity. But like you mentioned in the book, in multiple ways, why can't we celebrate and respect and value the Jewish people being completely Jewish? Now, I know there's not a monolithic group where everybody practices their faith the same exact way or has the same exact philosophies.
That's part of the point. That's
just like yes. All Christians aren't the same, because there's the evangelicals and there's the Anglicans and there's, you know, so there's all this. But why not? Why does it have to be erased? Why couldn't the little Daniel boy in the museum have his Jewishness on display, even if it was alongside the soccer?
Well, that's sort of right. That's the piece that, right. Well, that's the piece that's kind of interesting to me. And, you know, I think that part of it is that, you know, it's sort of a strategy on the part of Jewish communities in a non-Jewish society that sort of like have to figure out some way to sort of
blend in,
you know, have allies, and to you know, to fit in, but to not fit in because like, oh, you want to be like everyone else, but really just out of, you know, self-preservation, right? So I mean, and that's like really, to me, that's like a tragic legacy of anti-Semitism, is that there is this idea that like one has to erase oneself in order to gain public respect. That is in itself like a form of anti-Semitism, even if it's internalized over generations. And, you know, I think you see that in so many different contexts. You know, and I think that there, you know, in a way, it's what you're really talking about is like a challenge to the American idea of diversity, right? Because right now we're having, you know, we have this huge public conversation about diversity and inclusion and like, you know, how do we think about the evils of the past? It's like, well, you know, Jews have thousands of years of experience on this topic, first of all, but also, there's sort of like, it's a real challenge to say, like, does diversity mean you get lots of people from lots of different backgrounds who all think the same way?
Mm-hmm.
Or are we going to sort of like, really challenge the idea of what it means, of living in a pluralistic society? And when you mention sort of like, there are, lots of Christians with lots of different beliefs, like, well, yeah, and there are lots of Jews with lots of different beliefs. And like, sort of like, that should be like, that's part of the conversation.
Exactly.
And like, that shouldn't always be easy or comfortable, right? I mean, that's another thing is that, I titled this book, People Love Dead Jews. I did not want people to be comfortable, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think that this need to make other people feel comfortable is kind of part of the problem.
Right. Right.
And I think that anybody who's ever been in a situation where they don't feel they don't feel free to have full agency is going to feel a little bit of that need to make other people feel comfortable. I feel this way sometimes as a woman, honestly, like because I've published books for the past 20 years. I've given a lot of public talks about my books. One thing I've learned is that, whenever I give a public talk, no matter how grim what I'm saying is, I have to smile. Right? Because as women, we know that we don't want to look aggressive, mm-hmm. right? There's sort of like this little.
That wasn't the word I was thinking, but yes.
Well, yeah, you can think of lots of words, but that's sort of like, it's a strategy in a sense, mm-hmm. right? But it's like, it's kind of you've internalized this sort of, lowering of your own dignity, and you sort of feel like you have to play that game. And so I see this also in the way Jews often will respond to anti-Semitic attacks in a sort of larger context, where they'll say things like, Jews are the canary in the coal mine. When Jews are attacked, it's like a sign of the decline of the society, right? Or they'll bring out, there's a quote from some I think it's a Protestant theologian, Reiner Neumuller, I'm going to get his name wrong. First they came for the Jews,
oh, right.
And I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew, and then they came for the so this Jews are the canary in the coal mine, right? Like when Jews are attacked, it's a sign of this decline of society. Think of how much it is a denigration of one's own integrity to have to make that argument. Because what you're basically saying is, we should all care when Jews are murdered or maimed, because it might be an ominous sign that later real people will get attacked.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like you have to erase yourself in order to gain public respect. And that's what I'm really pushing back against in this book.
I know I want to sort of pose a hypothetical. So if you were to meet up with those girls who are now women, right? Or the ones in Mississippi, the ones that were in your quiz competition, the ones in the hotel. Oh,
yes.
So and you were just wanted to just have a chat with them and follow up, and you met some, they have all good intentions, and they want to learn about you and your culture, and they want to support you and your culture, and they don't, what would you say to someone who has these best of intentions? And you mentioned this in your book with several of the characters that with the historical figures that you go through, but what would you say to someone who wants to combat anti-Semitism, to identify it and combat it and help in this quest, but maybe has some of those limitations of just the Western civilization or the Christendom viewpoint of everything? So they have the best of intention, but they need to what would you want them to see? Or what would you say to them to say, look, if you want to really help or be a part of this, or even just learn about it, do this or look for that, or what would your advice be?
Sure. So there's a few things. One thing I've thought about a lot is, lately, is the way that Jews are presented to a larger, the larger society. And this is something I get to in that story about these two girls I met from Mississippi, who were clearly, they were on their school's academic team. They were clearly top of their class, and these weren't dumb people, right? But, they're getting their information from Hitler. And I'm like, this is odd, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and so, and I, as I say in the book, I remember calling my mom from the hotel payphone and being like, I don't get it. These are supposed to be the smart people, right? And the answer was, and as I put it in the book, like, these people had very well-intentioned education, and in their well-intentioned education, they only learned about dead Jews. And here's what I mean by that. And I don't really spell this out exactly in the book. So what I'm telling you now is a little bit beyond the book. Think about what you read about Jews in, let's say, a middle school or a high school social studies textbook. If it's a book that has something about ancient civilization in it, then there's probably like a little page or two about the Israelites. And, it doesn't even really mention that those are Jews, right? Those are dead people from a long time ago. Like, they might as well be the Phoenicians, right? And then there's like, if it's a textbook that has modern, has modern history in it, there's probably like a chapter toward the end about the Holocaust, where, the Jews are this like nice metaphor for like, the limits of civilization and how low we can all sink and what's like, we're going to learn from these people's deaths, right? But it's not about the experience. So a few things I would say. One is an awareness of what Jewish experience today is actually like, in the positives and negatives of Jewish experience in the United States. And here's an example I'll give from just my own experience as a parent. I have 4 children. When my daughter was younger, she was in our synagogue's children's choir. And at one point they had a Thanksgiving service. There was like an interfaith Thanksgiving service that was for several congregations in the town. And it was like at a church down the street from our synagogue. And so I'm taking my daughter to this church for this Thanksgiving service where she's going to perform with this choir. And it's so basic that it's like, I can't even believe that I'm telling you this as a story. We walk into this church and we're like in the lobby area of this church. And my daughter, who's I think about maybe 9 years old at the time, just turns to me and she says, "You mean you can just walk in?" And I'm like, "Yeah, you can just walk in." And she's like, "There's nobody here that's making sure it's okay for us to be here." And what she means is our synagogue, like most synagogues in the entire world, has an armed security guard. And you can't just walk into a synagogue because there's going to be someone there who's making sure that you are there and not
supposed
armed.
to be there, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, and the rabbi of our synagogue, I remember it, and I mentioned this in the book, was at a local meeting for local clergy that was convened by the town police. That was a meeting about security for congregations. And he told me later how he's like, I'm just sitting there in stunned silence while all these church officials from these, 7 Christian congregations in the town are talking about whether or not to put a lock on a church door. Meaning like, that like buzzer lock where you have to buzz to get in. And they're talking about how, well, we don't really want to do this because it makes us seem like we're not welcoming. And he's like, I'm sitting here just stupefied in stunned silence because like, we just did active shooter training with the nursery school staff.
Right.
And he's just like, I don't think these people know what the reality is that we're dealing with. We're literally, and this is the other thing, like I was at that church with my daughter down the street, like, what am I supposed to tell her? I can't tell her, oh, it's a different neighborhood.
Right.
It's down the block. Down the block. And so it's like, I think there may be a lack of awareness about that. So that's like one thing, that's sort of on the more negative side. But the other piece is, on the more positive side, that there's just like a lack of curiosity about this Jewish civilization that's like really kind of astonishing. And when I say it's astonishing, like what this civilization has achieved is astonishing. And if we were to learn about it, it would upend a lot of what we think about the history of the West. And what I mean by this is, we often think of Jewish history as being what one famous Jewish historian called the lachrymose view of Jewish history, this litany of persecutions. But what's more interesting about Jewish history is that it's a litany of resilience. Because in each of these situations over the course of history, it's like Jews shouldn't still be here. Right. Like there aren't a lot of other ancient people who have like been through all these things and are still here. That took a lot of effort. Right. And when I say a lot of effort, I mean, like, you have to really actively educate your children to be Jewish, especially when you're living in a non-Jewish society and they're not getting it from anywhere else. Because that's something else that I mentioned in the front of the book when I met those 2 girls from Mississippi, and they, of course, assumed I was Christian and said, how often do you go to church? And I was like, they're like, oh, you must be less religious. How often do you go to church?
Yeah,
and
that was an excellent illustration, that idea of religiousness, right? Because they discounted you being religious because you didn't do it their religion, right? their practices,
yes.
rather than just saying, then understanding the fact that you actually were probably more religious because of the daily practice and the effort it
yes. Well, and not
to-
just that it's not, when I say more, I don't know that, more or less religious, who knows, but like
Yeah.
more, it's to me that it takes so much more effort to be Jewish,
right.
because none of it, you have to do it all yourself when you're
Mhm.
living in a non-Jewish society. So it's like, none of it is coming to you from like, the outside world, right? Like,
Right.
like if I like want my children to learn Hebrew, they're not going to learn Hebrew in public school,
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like I have to take my kids out, like, you know how many days of school my kids miss for
Mhm.
Jewish holidays? Like, yeah, they close for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but like, you know how many other holidays there are? There's like 18
Right.
holidays. My
Right.
kids miss
Right.
a lot of school, right? I mean, like, do I, what it takes to like teach your kids Hebrew? Like when it's not like offered in, I mean, this is why a lot of Jewish families will send their children to Jewish schools for that reason, because it takes a huge amount of effort. And also like and also because there's this history that is outside of there. So like one thing that happened to my children in our school district, 6th grade is when they do social studies in 6th grade is ancient civilizations. So, and each of my children, when they were in 6th grade, has at some point during the year come home to me and been very confused, where they say to me, in school, we're learning about all these great civilizations of the past. Like we learned about ancient Egypt, we learned about ancient Babylonia, we learned about ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Persia. And they say, and we learned about all these amazing achievements of these civilizations. Okay, this guy's blowing his leaves.
That one I heard.
Okay, so we're learning about all these great ancient civilizations, but at home, for each of these ancient civilizations, we have a holiday about how they tried to kill us. So like, wow. I'm confused, are these great civilizations or are they not? And the answer is yes, right? And that's sort of where it gets interesting, right? Because like, ancient Egypt achieved all these great engineering feats and they did it with slave labor, right? Like ancient Rome conquered the world and that involved like subjugating these native populations, including the Jews. Right. So it's sort of like, those, you have to sort of, your children end up having this more nuanced view. And imagine if that history were included in general history that we learn in public school, because the Jews are not like, I mean, it's not like some like obscure ethnic group that hasn't had this impact on the rest of the world, right? I mean, Judaism is like foundational to the history of the West through Christianity and Islam, right? I mean, it's like you can't like teach this history without this piece. And also like, it's also Judaism is like this counterculture that weaves its way through the history of the West. And it's like, and I think the reason people don't want to teach this and would rather erase Jewish history from this story is because it would tell them things that, again, don't make people feel good about themselves.
Right.
And I don't just mean persecutions. I mean something a little deeper, which is about a challenge to our ideas about, about diversity, freedom, education, all those things, because Jews are sort of have always been this sort of non-conforming piece in these societies. So my favorite little mini example of this is about literacy. Think about the way you learned about the history of like mass literacy in school. You probably
the Gutenberg press and all that.
Yeah, right. Like before the printing press, like only the clergy and the nobles and the royalty knew how to read, but then you had the printing press and then you had, later industrial production, and then hooray, you can have mass literacy. Well, the problem with that is that it's a lie, because, Jewish communities had universal literacy like 1,000 years before the printing press. Right? I mean, like poor Jewish kids in like 12th century Yemen knew how to read, right? I mean, and it's sort of like, it turns out you don't need advanced technology or mass, wealth for people to learn how to read. You just have to think that reading is important.
Yep.
Well, nobody wants to hear that, because then that sounds like, wow, our society didn't think reading was important. That was, maybe a mistake, right? So that doesn't make people feel good about themselves. So it's that kind of, history that I think is really important. And so I would encourage people like, those girls who I met, however many years ago, like to learn more about this culture and start by connecting with living Jews, right? I mean, and, that's something that I think is, really valuable. It's like, you have living Jewish communities, all over this country, and who are sort of, would be very happy to sort of, to like welcome their neighbors. And sort of, and to really learn the richness of this heritage. And I think that also would enrich a lot of people's Christian identity too, because of course,
I absolutely
so much of Christianity is built on these, and I will tell you sort of, with my novels all deal with Jewish history and tradition. And I mean, I have a lot of Christian readers who are really interested in, we have a shared scripture, right? So, I mean, that's something that, and I mean, Jews are reading the scriptures in the original,
Exactly.
right? And, and so that's sort of, we have a lot to talk about. And so, I think engaging with this sort of living Jewish culture would really go a long way, instead of this sort of being like Jews as this like metaphor.
Right.
Is really what I'm pushing back against in this book.
I just think that is such valuable insight, and I agree with you totally that Christians, as sincere as they may be, without looking at the Jewish culture, the Hebrew scriptures, and how it is still the Hebrew scriptures are still alive today in your communities. And I think sometimes people get nervous, like, well, I have some Jewish neighbors, or I have some Jewish friends at work, or I have some Jewish friends from school. Would they be insulted or think I'm weird if I ask them about themselves or their families or their daily lives or outlooks on things? But we have to be able to open that dialogue, and sometimes you have to feel uncomfortable, I suppose.
Yes, well, I think it's the feeling uncomfortable. I mean, and I will tell you that there are many American Jews who maybe would feel sort of nervous about that, but that is part of the legacy of anti-Semitism.
I agree.
Like American Jews are not wrong to sort of be like,
no,
wow,
defensive.
Why does this person want to just show up like at my Sabbath dinner table or something, right? Because it does feel like a little weird, right? But the reason it feels weird is because of this legacy of anti-Semitism.
Exactly, and that's a key point. And I just hope our viewers can really be inspired by your words to us, and your words that are written down in your book. And I will also share the link to your podcast. I'll put a screen up so people can find your podcast, Adventures with Dead Jews, because those are really fun to listen to. I mean, they're fun to listen to because
you can have with Dead Jews, right?
Yeah, because you are actually you have a great production staff when you're producing those podcasts, and you do a great job in storytelling. And I really value that, and I appreciate your hard work in those ways. And I love the fact that you are willing to come on and share with our network your insights. And I encourage our folks to really explore the Jewish culture, the Jewish religion. We have a podcast going on right now through the Minor Prophets that happens on Fridays with Shelley Neese, and we do have that shared scripture from which we can learn so much. And
I was going to say, my daughter right now is taking a course on the minor, as you would say, the minor prophets.
And I love listening to a rabbi, or reading a rabbi's exegesis or a sermon or an explanation of a passage. I just feel like that because of the context, some context, a Jewish scholar who's sharing that ancient piece of text in our world today, just keeps it of today. I love when scripture is relevant today, and I think that
well, that's the whole premise of Judaism, right? That's the whole premise of Judaism.
Exactly.
And so I would say, if I think it is important to make connections with living Jews. What I would probably encourage your viewers to do is less talk to their Jewish friend at work, because that always feels very strange. Because because also and I think this is true for a lot of minority groups. It's like you feel like suddenly you're given this job where you have to
you're to be the ambassador for your
and people don't really want to. Not everybody wants that job, but the person who does want that job is the rabbi of the local synagogue. That person, that is their job.
Right.
So that's the person to approach about that. Even if it's through doing a interfaith event, like a study event with a local congregation or something. I think that's sort of a more meaningful way to engage than just cornering somebody at the water cooler or something.
Right.
Yeah.
No,
and because rabbis are really interesting. I mean, rabbis can talk to you about the Torah all day long. That's what they love to do.
Yeah.
Right. And your friend at the water cooler, maybe not. So.
Yeah. I think that if you want to engage with just your Jewish friends and neighbors, it's just about being a normal friend, normal curiosity. When someone says, "What are you doing this weekend?" Oh, it's our holiday of name a holiday, Sukkot or something.
Yes.
Oh, can you explain that? What is that? Just a natural, just a
Yes.
natural curiosity about what that weekend might be for their family or something.
Yes.
So,
And also not sort of imposing sort of, and I think people do this unconsciously,
and
imposing.
don't judge it. Yeah.
Well, I'm not even just judging it, but like imposing their structure of what they feel is a religion onto a different culture, because it often doesn't fit. Right. Because that's something else, is that, for example, I know a lot of Christian belief, a lot of Christian practice is like very belief driven for a lot of people, and in Judaism is like tends to be much more practice driven. Right. And so that's sort of like, those things are like, it's kind of hard to, like, even feels weird to me when someone says like, oh, the Jewish faith, because it's like, are there Jewish beliefs? Of course there are, but like much more central in Judaism is the idea of commandment. Practice, commandment.
Practice.
Like that's the basic. It's less about sort of like, in Christianity, there's much more about profession of belief. And while, yes, that's important in Judaism too, in Judaism, it's much more about accepting commandments, right? So it's just sort of like they're different traditions, and the language doesn't always fit, right? I mean, and that's why, and you see that awkwardness, like when people talk about like, oh, it's the holiday season. It's like, well, actually the Jewish holiday season is in the fall, right? Because that's when we have like literally 4 major holidays are all within a 4-week span that happens in like September or October. So, like, yeah, there's Hanukkah, but like, I mean, Hanukkah is just like not a very important holiday. So, that's sort of, it's a post-biblical holiday. Like, it's literally ranked. Like, there's the ones, the holidays that are most important.
Exactly, like the high holy days.
Yes, right. The high holy days, and it's not the high holy days. There's there's Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, but then there's also there's Sukkot, which is a week-long holiday after that, and Simchat Torah, Shmini Atzeret, and Simchat Torah are another. There's a whole, that's the real holiday season where it's like, bam, 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 I have to take like all these days off from work, and like all of that kind of stuff. Like, that's all happening. Like, and like, oh, and the family's coming over and we're having the big meal. Like, all that stuff is happening in the fall. It's not really, it's not happening in the winter. Like, in the winter, there isn't really that kind of holiday going on. So, it sort of has become that way because, stores want to sell stuff for.
Well, yeah, the calendar is predicated on the Christian holiday.
Exactly, right. But that's the idea, right? But that's what I mean by that sort of, that premise of like, we're going into this from a frame.
Right.
It's like, thinking about the frame where you're talking about it. So, the holidays that like make my life slow down and mean like, oh gosh, I got to take off all this time from work and I got to plan my menus and all like the things that one associates with like a stressful or joyful holiday season. Depending if you're the one doing the cooking or whatever. Right. All those sort of like associated like excitement / stress / joy / spiritual meaning. All that stuff is happening in the Jewish calendar in the fall. Yeah. Right. And again at Passover too. But those are sort of the 2 big times of year when it's like those kinds of feelings. Whereas like now it's like, you light some candles and there's like stuff you do for kids, but like it's not it's not like a stop the world kind of situation at all in the winter. So those kinds of things are important for people to know.
Yeah, to be sensitive and and I like the way you put it. Just when you have a genuine curiosity, you want to not put your framework over top of whatever it is you're trying to find out about, right?
Yeah, and it's hard not to do that.
Exactly. I
mean, it's easier for Jews to not do that because Jews are used to being the minority and are used to not assuming that other people, share their culture or beliefs. So that's, that's sort of, Jews sort of are coming into it already sort of translating themselves. Right.
That's a good way to put it, translating themselves. Well, Dara, thank you so much. You've given me a lot of your time and I'm very grateful for that. And thank you so much. And
many thanks to Dara Horn for her time and energy. Again, I encourage you to go to her website and read her archived articles, order her novels, and most recent book. We have much to learn from Dara, who shares with us through her fiction and nonfiction books and articles and podcasts that will enlighten us as we continue to combat anti-Semitism and advocate for Jews worldwide and the State of Israel. We must seek deep and meaningful relationships with our Jewish friends, neighbors, and colleagues, appreciating them with all our heart, learning from them, and advocating for them. Shavua Tov, and have a great